Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please turn off all electronic devices during the duration of the program. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Gordon Sondland.
Good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you all for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedom around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, I want to make sure we recognize a special guest that we have in our audience this evening, and I know a number of you would recognize him. That would be Congressman Elton Gallegly and his lovely wife, Janice. Earlier today, a freight car arrived at the Reagan Library. It is a German-made World War II Model 2 freight car. One of the freight cars that was used to transport Jews and other victims of the Nazi regime to the infamous concentration camps. It will be part of an exhibit on the horrors of the Holocaust that will open here in March of next year. The car arrived today because today is November 10th, and it is November 10th that marks the anniversary of Kristallnacht. Tonight, we welcome to our stage former United States Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland. For Ambassador Sondland, this car has a haunting significance. His parents, unlike so many, were able to escape Nazi Germany in time. But they too could just as easily been taken away in one of these cars. Instead, they were able to make their way to America, where they raised a family. Their son would go on to a successful career in the hotel business before returning as a United States ambassador to the continent that his parents once fled. Ambassador, thank you for your service, for your assistance in underwriting the exhibit soon to come, and for sharing your family story with us today and in your book. And we are here to talk about Gordon's book, a new memoir, barely 2 weeks old, but already praised by the New York Times and by others as a fascinating look behind the scenes of foreign affairs and the policies of the previous administration. I'd read that Gordon decided to be an ambassador back in his 20s. Well, not only did he achieve that goal, but instead of serving as an ambassador to just one country, like so many others, he managed to be an ambassador to a collection of more than 24. He may have gotten more than he bargained for. It's not often that an ambassador becomes a household name. When he walks through the produce aisle, through an airport, out to dinner, people come up to him saying, "Whoa, it's that guy." Yes, many people know Ambassador Sondland from his time testifying before the nationally televised impeachment hearings of Donald Trump in 2020. But that wasn't his only front seat to history. After all, in 2019, he was the one introducing many leaders to a young, new Ukrainian president, former comedian by the name of Volodymyr Zelensky. During his service from 2018 to 2020, Gordon worked to strengthen the ties between the United States and the European Union. But as he recounts, his diplomatic skills were often tested as much on this side of the Atlantic as on the side in Europe. Today, Ambassador Sondland has no scores to settle, no hidden agenda, and tonight we will get a rare, unvarnished look at the world of international diplomacy. All of you have chosen a great night to be at the Reagan Library. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 20th United States Ambassador to the European Union, the founder and chairman of Provenance Hotels, and a friend of the Reagan Library, to be sure, Ambassador Gordon Sondland. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Welcome, Gordon, to the Reagan Library.
Thank you. It's really an honor.
When you graduated from college, I wonder if you ever felt that as you progressed in your career that you were just going to succeed in the world of business and the world of politics, like beyond your wildest dreams?
Well, that was a really loaded question because I didn't graduate.
Oh,
I dropped out. I did 2 years at the University of Washington. It's funny, I probably could not get into the University of Washington today. They would have me come lecture, but they would never admit me as a student. I was very, very restless and bored with formal education. I just wanted to go make money. I grew up in a very lower middle class enclave within a very wealthy community. And jealousy played a huge part, envy and jealousy played a huge part in my sort of formative years, because I saw other kids at school drive a new car when they were 16, go to Europe and Hawaii on vacation, and my parents couldn't afford that. And so, to me, my goal was financial independence, and that's what I focused on. And it wasn't the best driver, but it was the driver.
yeah. What's your connection to Auschwitz? You've been such a generous contributor to the library, and I know it ties to your family, obviously. What is the connection?
My parents were both born in Germany. My dad was born in Danzig, which is now part of Poland, Gdansk. My mother was born in Berlin. They met in Berlin in the early 30s. My mother was 15 when she met my dad. My dad was probably around 20, 21. Not an unusual pairing. They married when she was 16. She was pregnant immediately, and then they had to leave. So my mother could get out with her family because they had a Russian background, and those with Russian passports were allowed to leave. So they got on a boat, headed for Paraguay, and were told, when you get to Paraguay, don't stay here, go to Uruguay, because Uruguay is a lot friendlier to Jews than Paraguay. So my mother and her family settled in Uruguay. My mother didn't speak Spanish at the time, had a daughter in Uruguay, and when my father saw her for the first time, she was 7 years old. My father was smuggled out of Germany to France, joined the French Foreign Legion, Otherwise, he would have gone to a concentration camp in Germany. Fought with the Foreign Legion in Northern Africa, was captured, was in a concentration camp for a year, and then was rescued by the British Army. And his name was Gunther Sondland, very German name. When he joined the British Army, he changed it to Gerald Southland, just to give it a little more of a British flavor. And ultimately, I mean, this is a very long story, but ultimately they were reunited again when my sister turned 7 in Uruguay. And then they eventually emigrated to the United States, where I was born. I was absolutely a mistake. My mother was 36 when she had me. She had my sister when she was 16. So we're 20 years apart, and there are no other siblings.
Wow.
Yeah.
In hotel business, I know you've been in the hugely successful in the hotel business for several decades now. How did you decide to get into that business?
I was in the real estate business selling little apartment buildings, and I sort of worked my way up the company that I joined. And one day, one of the guys who worked for me brought me a hotel that was in bankruptcy. I knew nothing about hotels. And I said, let me figure this out. This looks like a really cheap hotel to buy. And I worked with some people that were in the hotel business, and I went to my boss and I said, if I'm able to raise the money to buy this, can I buy it as opposed to selling it to one of our clients? And, like a good entrepreneur businessman, he said, as long as our company gets the full commission, I don't care if you buy it. So I was able to talk some investors into putting up some money and bought that hotel, and it turned out to be a success through no skill of mine, because I didn't know the hotel business. I hired people who knew the business, and they did well by me. And that became the first of many hotels.
Well, there's another guy I know of that was in the hotel business, Donald Trump. How did you first meet Trump, and was it because you were both in the hotel business together, or no, it was all politics?
It's a great story. It was in 1988 at the Republican convention, I'm sorry, not at the Republican convention, at the acceptance speech for George H.W. Bush in New Orleans. And I'm at the Marriott Hotel in New Orleans, and I walked to the elevator lobby, and there's one person standing there, and it was Donald Trump. He was all by himself. There was no one around. I wasn't interrupting anything. And I walked up to him, and I introduced myself, and he was very dismissive. And I said, I noticed in the New York Times you just bought the Plaza in New York, and you're really getting screwed by Weston, who was running the Plaza at the time, and you're going to sue them. He said, yeah, that's right. And I said, well, we bought a hotel that's also being run by Weston, and we're being similarly screwed. Maybe we should compare notes. He blew me off completely. Didn't want to talk about it. Didn't even say, well, here's my card, give me a call. Just didn't want to discuss it. So the next day, I'm sitting in the bar with John Sununu and with the gentleman who brought me to the convention in the first place, very important guy in the Republican Party. Trump walks in, looks around the room, he sees Sununu, he comes over, he sits down, he looks at me, he remembers me from the day before. Couldn't have been nicer. And when I reminded him of that, because he asked me when I reconnected with him in 2016, so I met him in '88, I never saw him again until 2016. And I went to his office in New York at Trump Tower, and I said, he said, have we met before? And I said, yeah. I said, we met in New Orleans in 1988, and you were a total dick. And much to his credit, he goes, I was? And I said, yes, you were. He said, well, what did I do? And I told him the story. And he said, well, of course I was nice to you the second night because you were with very important people. And I said, who says that? And he said, well, are you over it now? And I said, well, I'm here, aren't I? He said, good point. Okay.
Yeah, well, right around that, I know at that moment, as you are now, you're headquartered in Portland, Oregon, and I know it well, and it's as liberal a city as you can get. And I found it fascinating in your book. You talk about how when you got behind Trump for president in a big way, it was a very public thing, and it became known. You were a big Trump supporter right there in Portland, and you paid a price for that.
I might as well have been a neo-Nazi, literally.
Yeah.
In Portland, the name Trump and Portland are oil and water. They don't mix. And people were threatening our business. They were threatening our employees. And this is before he became president. I mean, he was running for president. So it was a very, very difficult situation. I had a partner at the time who was the COO of my company, who worked for me. He was Muslim. He was a Syrian. And when Trump made his ungracious comments about Khizr Khan, this person came into my office and said, you know, that makes me very uncomfortable. And I said, say no more. You're more important to me than a political campaign. I'll step out. I had already raised quite a bit of money for the campaign. I said, you know, I called the campaign. I said, I can't do anything more. I'm uncomfortable with the Khizr Khan situation. And so the campaign wasn't happy. I left. And when Trump was elected, this same person came back into my office and said, you know, I'm a good Republican. You were trying to support the president. I'm over this now. Why don't you get back involved if you want to? You have no problem with me. I said, okay, why don't we go to the inauguration? So I said, let's take our families. You ever been to a presidential inauguration? He said, never. I said, I'm going to buy the big ticket. I had made a little money that year. The big ticket was $1 million. You got the best seats. You got the best parties, the best access. So I took my family, his family, and we went to the inauguration. And of course, the conventional wisdom is that that's what bought me the ambassadorship, but there's so much more to it than that.
Yeah. You need to read the book. You'll see there's so much more. You know, you did become ambassador to the European Union, but I know that you raised a lot of money for the Trump campaign, as you said, and the inaugural. You could have had your pick of a lot of different jobs, you know, Deputy Secretary of Commerce or Assistant Secretary of the Navy or whatever you might. Why did you choose an ambassador's post as how you wanted to jump in?
Well, having been a CEO in the private sector, once you become a CEO, you're kind of always a CEO. And an ambassadorship is about as close to being a CEO as you can get, short of being the president himself. Because the ambassador is, in fact, the legal stand-in for the president in whatever country or whatever organization you're accredited to. A lot of people don't know this, but when you're the ambassador to a country, you're the highest ranking federal official in that country. So other than military people who are engaged in combatant activities, the military, the intelligence community, the agriculture department, the commerce department, everyone in that country reports to the ambassador.
A miniature presidency.
It's a miniature presidency. That's exactly what it is. And you also have a lot of autonomy because you're basically given a letter of introduction to the leader of that country or that organization signed by the President of the United States. And it's not a form letter, it's a very personal letter. And it basically says, John Highbush is my representative to fill in the blank country. Please look upon him as my representative of the United States, and whatever he shall say or do on behalf of the United States, please give it full credence. So it's sort of like a power of attorney almost. You are the stand-in president. You can sign documents and bind the United States. You can do all kinds of things. And just understanding the sheer weight of that authority and responsibility makes you exercise it very carefully.
Sure, yeah. As I was saying, and I introduced you, you know, any number of people like you would choose to be ambassador to France, ambassador to Great Britain. They pick a particular country. But you were the ambassador to the European Union. So where does that ambassador hang his or her hat? Is it in Brussels? And how do you represent the United States to so many countries?
Well, it's a very interesting dance. Yes, you're in Brussels. There are actually 3 ambassadors in Brussels. There's the United States ambassador to NATO, which is also based in Brussels. there's the United States ambassador to Belgium, and then, of course, there's the United States ambassador to the European Union. And that's called a tri-mission. There are 3 missions. So all 3 ambassadors, the first problem is all 3 ambassadors, we all have big egos, we all think we're the boss, and we all have to learn to get along and dance. I was extremely fortunate because the ambassador to NATO was former Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison, who was absolutely terrific, and the ambassador to Belgium was a friend, Ambassador Ron Gidwitz. So the 3 of us worked really closely together because between the 3 of us, we had about close to 3,000 people that we were responsible for and a lot of assets because a lot of those 3 missions were coordinated together. So it was a big undertaking. We tried to each stay in our lane, to use our colleagues when we needed. If I needed help from NATO, if NATO needed help from the EU, then we consulted and coordinated. But it was like 3-dimensional chess.
Having done it now for a couple of years, take away the whole impeachment hearings and that whole experience, just as an ambassador. Did it turn out to be as fantastic as you thought it might be back in your 20s when you were aspiring to be ambassador? And would you do it again?
I'd do it again in a heartbeat. And the reason I do it again in a heartbeat is it's like any job. Once you have the learning curve that's gone by and you really understand whether you're doing brain surgery or you're fixing a car engine or you're an ambassador, once you understand the process, you really can hit the ground running. Was it an incredible job? It was the worst job and the best job. You had the highest highs and the lowest lows because you had this feeling that, like driving a supertanker, the supertanker representing the United States of America, people are making all kinds of noise all the time about we should do this and we should do that and so on and so forth. And everyone is giving speeches and thinking they're making policy at think tanks and so on. But you know what? At the end of the day, and I'm not saying this to be critical, but it's just reality, they're all just making noise. The supertanker just keeps going. As an ambassador, when you turn that wheel, the supertanker turns because you actually have the ability. You're not like the little kid on the right side of the car with the play steering wheel while daddy's driving and you're doing this and the car just keeps going. You actually turn the wheel and the car turns. And once you realize that the car turns, that you can pick up the phone and call someone and either make something happen or really screw something up badly by saying the wrong thing, all of a sudden you realize I now have the tools to advance the policy of the United States. And that policy is as dictated by whoever the president is. It's not what the State Department bureaucracy thinks it is, it's what the president thinks. And I would say that for President Obama, President Biden, President Bush, and certainly President Trump. The people who work there day in and day out, and there are many, many loyal, hardworking bureaucrats that understand what their job is, which is to advance the agenda of whoever happens to be the president at the time. There are also many who don't do that, and in fact push back really, really hard, which makes my job a lot more difficult than that of my colleagues.
Yeah, I want to get to that issue of deep state in just a minute, but before I do you feel like you succeeded in your role? Did you have measurable accomplishments that you look back on and say, I did that?
I did, and it's so gratifying that once you have one accomplishment, I guess it's like catching fish or hitting a hole in one, you want to keep doing it. And the biggest disappointment was the impeachment hearings for Ukraine, because when that occurred toward the end of 2019, we had already accomplished a great deal, but we were on the cusp of accomplishing so much more in so many areas. And I view it through a business lens of a deal closing. I view, this to me wasn't a journey where it's all about the journey, it was about the result. And we had 6 or 7 or 8 big initiatives that were ready to close, to put it in a business vernacular, all of which got derailed because no one could focus on anything but the circus that was going on in Congress at the time.
Yeah. JCPOA, the Iran deal, you had the responsibility to get the U.S.'s viewpoint across with respect to enough of the Iran deal. It's not for us, the United States. And tell me about your role in having to work with the European partners who are not necessarily on that track.
Well, it was a shitty deal. There's no other way to put it. It gave Iran all the benefits and none of the downside. We got all the downside. It's been characterized in many different ways, but put it very simply, they get cash, they get to keep enriching uranium, even though they claim they were not. They get to use the cash to create mischief and malign activities all around the world, and we get to sit back and watch the show. And Trump instinctively said, you know, the way you change behavior is you make people poor. Because when they don't have money, they can't do mischievous things. It's very expensive to create mischief. It's not free. And so he wanted to bring their oil output down from what it was to as close to zero as possible. And of course, what we had in the EU, we had what's called an HRVP, which is really a Secretary of State, in the person of Federica Mogherini, who was the counterpart to Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. And Mogherini was one of the authors of the original JCPOA. So she was madly in love with her work. And she didn't want to hear any facts. She didn't want to see any intelligence, which I went to the ends of the earth to get her read in on, to show her what the Iranians were doing. Don't bother me with the facts. I love this JCPOA. This is a fantastic deal. I did it. And between she and John Kerry, they created this illusion, which really was an illusion, that I think several in the administration, starting with the president, said this is complete bullshit. It doesn't work. And as a result, we really had the Iranians on the ropes. Again, it takes time. But, of course, the Europeans, always ready to make a dime, said, no, we want to keep doing business with Iran. So the way we get around the sanctions is we create this bartering system called Instex. And they created this thing out of whole cloth. It never existed before, and it was a way to circumvent our sanctions. So then I had the pleasant duty of going around telling various foreign leaders, listen, you can do business with Iran, or you can do business with the United States, but you can't do business with both. So pick one. And that did not go down well. But at the end of the day, had that pressure been kept applied all the way through, had President Biden simply kept that pressure on after President Trump left office, the Iranians right now would be at our doorstep wanting to talk because their economy was literally about to crater.
Similar situation with Nord Stream 2, albeit now we're talking Russia, right? And in this case, I think the United States, you were prescient with respect to what was going to happen if Nord Stream 2 was allowed to occur. So where do we sit now with respect to Ukraine and Nord Stream 2 and the rest? They've learned their lesson now, have they not? Or have they?
No. I wish I could say I were prescient because that would make me look like a genius. And I'm not a genius. No one was a genius that said Putin will use a world event to leverage his gas supply to Europe and will turn the gas off. That was not a particularly remarkable statement to make. Yet we were laughed out of every meeting, both by the foreign leaders with whom we met and by the press in Europe, who said, you know, you guys are crazy, you're always, doomsayers, that's not how Putin operates anymore, welcome to the 21st century. I mean, pick a retort, and that's what we got. And I, wound up giving speeches saying, look, there are other sources of liquid natural gas. And I'm not, just to make sure you understand, I'm not here trying to sell US gas over Russian gas to sound like a competitor to Putin. I'm saying, great, buy our gas, buy the Turkish gas, buy the gas from the Middle East, buy it from anyone you want except Russia. Because Russia has a very unique capability that none of the others do, which is the switch. And it's exactly what's happening now.
Yeah. Let's talk about Trump for a minute. I pulled a quote from your book, which I thought was really interesting. This is your words.
Uh-oh.
Trump. He's an extremely sharp, decisive, and divisive figure who happens to have attention and ego issues that get in the way of his mostly sound policy positions. Stand by those words?
100%.
Tell us what kind of man is Donald Trump when you've had the ability to work closely with him?
So one of the anecdotes in the book, which really shows you the kind of person, it's such a small thing. We are about to greet a foreign leader who happened to be, his country happened to be the upcoming presidency of the European Council. They rotate every 6 months, and the presidency is one of the 28 countries, now 27, and they have the gavel, and they make the agenda, and they have a lot of parliamentary authority. So my strategy was, I'm going to get close to whoever the president or prime minister of the country is that's running the European Council so I can get stuff done with respect to the bureaucracy in the EU. Because I viewed the countries as the board of directors, and I viewed the EU people as the staff and the workers and the executives. So we were greeting this leader. I'm at the White House, and the president and I are standing in the middle of the treaty room waiting for the motorcade to pull up. And it's just the two of us, and the aides are surrounding the wall. There's no one in the middle of the room. And he's kind of shifting around, waiting, a little impatient. Reaches in his pocket and grabs a box of Tic Tacs and shakes the Tic Tacs in his hand, puts them in his mouth. He looks at me, and I go, what the fuck? He goes, what? And I said, aren't you going to share? And he goes, okay. And he reaches in his pocket, puts them in my hand. I did the same thing. I go, didn't your mother teach you to share your Tic Tacs? And the look was priceless, not on his face. He was already beyond it. But of the people that were all standing, the aides. Priceless. Did you just say what the fuck to the President of the United States? But the point is, he doesn't think of anyone but himself. You get out a pack of gum, you offer the gum to the person standing next to you, or your mints, or whatever. It's just not the way his mind works. And I know it's a stupid story, but it's symptomatic of how his mind works. It's always about him. And sometimes that has extraordinarily positive effects in a sort of twisted and perverse way. But often, he completely misses the point of what he's just accomplished. It's the old saying about the salesman who won't take yes for an answer and just keeps talking. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, the yes turns into a no because he didn't shut his mouth at the appropriate time. And that's what I found over and over and over again. Was I allowed to say that word?
Well, they haven't kicked us out yet.
That would be you.
I know you didn't work for Ronald Reagan. But I know you.
I was too young.
Yes, but I know you've studied him. You know who he is. Can you compare President Trump to President Reagan in any sense?
I don't think there's any comparison.
None. None.
No.
Would you say they're the exact opposites?
Yeah, I would. I think President Reagan was a modest, self-effacing person who really believed in a team and really believed in his people, I think President Trump was more of a typical entrepreneur. And one of the reasons I identified with him so closely was my mind worked in many ways in the same way. I hoped I didn't have that amount of hubris. I probably had a bunch of hubris, but hopefully not to that level. But it's sort of one of the symptoms of it was he was accused, for example, he was asked often about a transition team. And remember, he appointed Chris Christie briefly to head a transition team.
Yeah.
And his whole attitude toward the transition team, which is very typical of any entrepreneur, and if there are entrepreneurs in the audience, they'll understand this. You get very superstitious when you're about to close a deal, and you don't want anything to jinx it. And in his case, closing the deal was winning the presidency, was being elected president. He didn't care about the polls. He didn't care about what people were telling him or how much money he raised. He knew that the closing meant he got more votes than Hillary. That was it. So by putting a transition team together prior to that happening, to him was superstitiously awful, because it's sort of like measuring the curtains for an office that you may never get.
Sure.
And what that did, though, and I understand that mindset, and he wasn't wrong about, not being, not counting your chickens before they're hatched. But what that did was it prevented him from doing, for example, what Mitt Romney did, which was was sort of the bellwether for how to set up a transition team. Mitt Romney, and I was fortunate to have been asked to serve on Governor Romney's transition team, he had an entire shadow U.S. government set up, ready to immediately deploy on Inauguration Day, so that his loyalists could be in all of the critical places of power to make sure that the last administration didn't undermine what he was trying to do. President Trump didn't have the time to do that because he didn't want to start early enough, which he should have done. First of all, it's free. The government pays for it. They give you all the resources. They give you office space. They give you help, whatever you need. And he should have done that, but he was too superstitious to do it.
Wow. Zelensky, you were there and knew him, introduced him to many United States representatives. You were part of his world. People really underestimated him early on. Here's this guy, he's a comedian, he becomes president. I mean, my gosh. Now how have things turned out? You knew Zelensky early on. Are you surprised that he has become the leader that he is?
Well, he and Reagan have probably more in common than he and Trump because of the show business background. And even though Reagan had served as a two-term governor of California, you recall people were very critical of his competence to be president because he's just an actor. What does he know about running the United States? And Zelensky had a lot of the same allegations made. No, the answer to your question is we thought he was smart. We thought he was tough. We really thought Trump would like him because we thought that they had a kind of a similar personality. Zelensky was funny. He was quick. He was the kind of guy Trump would want to hang out with. That's why we tried so hard to get the two of them together. But could you ever know that this actor, this guy from show business, would put on a flak jacket and walk out in the middle of Kiev while the bullets are flying and the missiles are flying? You don't know that he would do that until he did it. And of course, it was very encouraging, and I don't want to misquote him, but when he said, "I don't need a ride, I need bullets," or something to that effect, we could have never predicted that.
Let's turn to the conversation the infamous conversation President Trump has with Zelensky over the phone. Now, having been involved in politics at one time or another, as I have, when I heard about what President Trump has defined as the perfect conversation, it just sounded every commonplace to me. This is exactly what leaders of countries, how they talk to one another. Yet, Trump's conversation with Zelensky was taken by the opposite party, by Congress, as almost the worst sin imaginable. What was your viewpoint on when that conversation took place?
Well, unfortunately, literally hours after the conversation had taken place, I received a readout of the conversation, which was barely a paragraph summary, which did not go into any of the detail. I talked to a couple of people, and as I was on my way to Kiev at the time the conversation took place, and they said, oh yeah, it was a great conversation. Zelensky really liked Trump. They talked about getting together. So none of what came through the whistleblower we didn't find that out until much later, until the complaint was filed and until the congressional activity began. But after reading that transcript over and over and over again, to me that did not rise to an impeachable level. January 6th is a different issue. So we have to be very, very careful about sort of mushing all of the Trump transgressions into a bucket. You can't do that. I look at the Trump presidency very simplistically because I can't deal with overly complicated concepts. I have to do it in a really simple way. He came down the escalator when he announced his candidacy, and from the time he came down the escalator until January 6th, he had really bad things that he said and did. He had really good things that he said and did, and everything in between. He was a package deal. Like many of us, you can't pick him apart. I heard more people say, well, I really like him, or I really like his policies, if he just wouldn't tweet, or if he just would do this, that's not how it works. You get him in his entirety, or you don't get him at all. It's a binary issue. So I viewed all of my interactions with him, right up until January 6th, including the famous Zelensky phone call, as in bucket A. And bucket A is none of this stuff warrants investigations or impeachments. It warrants the public knowing exactly what happened and deciding at the next election, do they want to re-up him or do they want to boot him out? This was a voter decision, everything he said and did, whether it was the famous tape on the bus about women, whether it was the things he said on the escalator about Mexicans. That's a voter question. January 6th, to me, was bucket B, which was an impeachable offense. And the reason is that if I learned one thing as an ambassador, the world, the Europeans and others, they look at us that we do one thing very uniquely. And I call it the turnover of the keys. We turn over the keys to the next leader better than anyone in the world does. And we do it in a very interesting way. The new president comes up to the White House, and the old president and spouse greet the new president, and you know they hate each other's guts. Even if they're in the same party, they hate each other's guts. And they're both full of shit, and they hate each other's guts. And then they get in the car together and they ride to the Capitol, and there's a photographer sitting in the car, and they smile and pretend like they're just two pals riding the inauguration, still hating each other's guts. And then the old president sits on the podium with the new president and gazes at him admiringly as he's giving his inaugural address. They hate each other's guts. And then the new president goes to the White House and waves goodbye to the old president and opens the drawer in the desk, and there's a nice letter. And you know what? That all sounds like a bunch of BS, but to the world, it's critical. That's how you do it. It's not done by a coup. It's not done at the point of a gun. It's not done through coercion. It's not done through familial transfer of power because this is my son and he gets to be the next president. Not because he's qualified. And that's how we do things. And what President Trump did by questioning the results of the election, by not doing the formality of going to the inauguration, and then even worse, by allowing the violence to continue and to happen in the first place, which he could have stopped. To me, that crossed the line. So everything before that, to me, was a voter decision. At that point, I thought that was impeachable.
Yeah. I want to turn to our friends in the audience. And I would bet that some or all of what Gordon has said, it might have spurred a question in your mind. Are any questions that you might have when you read Gordon's book? I know it will drive even more questions, but we'll start here, and if you could bring a microphone.
Yes, your last remark that he could have stopped it, I've always questioned that because the rioters weren't watching TV. So he could have stopped it with the National Guard that he offered up in advance, but how could he stop something that has started by making a statement?
Oh, I think he would have had to go a lot further than just making a statement. But I think if you dissect what happened, he watched it passively for a while. I think he encouraged people to march on the Capitol, perhaps not to enter the Capitol and tear the place up. But I think his bias was toward interfering with the process of certifying the next election, as opposed to making sure that the next election was not interfered with in any way. And I don't want to dissect every single action he took because everything is up for debate. But I can tell you in totality, if you look at it as, again, as a package, not as one individual move, but the fact that he did not attend the inauguration, which is it's critical to see two leaders pass the baton in autocracies that want to become democracies and in fledgling democracies that are hanging on by a fingernail. Watching that ceremony, and I was making light of it, but I shouldn't, because it's critically important. And when you take the totality of what he did do and what he didn't do, to me it was unforgivable. And that's my personal view. And I am a supporter, by the way. I supported him. I didn't agree with everything he said or did, but I supported him. I have never been a never-Trumper, nor have I been a Kool-Aid drinker, pro-Trumper. I've just been I'm calling the balls and strikes as I see them, and in this case, that's my view on the issue.
Good. Right here. The microphone.
What do you envision as potential end games for Putin in Ukraine, time horizons and likelihoods of various scenarios, including nuclear threats that we're told may or may not include radioactive fallout? What are the possibilities and what are their likelihoods?
I think unfortunately, most of those end games are under our control and that of our allies. I think the continued equivocation, even though we are approving new packages, we're sending progressively more sophisticated systems there in terms of defending airspace, in terms of more accurate targeting of kinetic weapons. We're doing it in a very sort of halting way. And I think at this point, all bets are off. Putin knows we're backing the Ukrainians. It's not a secret. He knows that they're a proxy for us at this point, even though they weren't at the beginning. And we need to end it with our allies. And we need to tell them, look, we're going to end it. We have to. We don't have a choice. Otherwise, this is going to drag on, and it's going to burden NATO ultimately, because this is the doorstep to Europe.
Other questions? Yeah, right back here. She's got a mic for you.
All right. California and the entire Southwest may run out of water sometime next year. I and many other people in the local newspapers have stated that to alleviate the problem, not completely solve it, a water pipeline needs to be built from Washington, Idaho, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, because that's where there's water. We have to do what the oil companies have been doing for over 100 years. You go out and find out where the oil is, you pump it out of the ground, and you put it in a pipe and spread it out through the United States. I have tried to explain this to my representatives for over 2 years, and they just are too dumb to understand the concept.
Thank you for your comment.
What do you do to understand this basic, to get this basic concept into their heads?
Gordon, just as a little background for you, and I don't know how many in the audience are facing this situation, but through most of LA, you're no longer allowed to water your lawn, for example, and there's a lot of envy for our friends in the Northwest who get rain just about every other day. So I don't know if you have a comment on this topic, but there you have it.
Yeah, I'm not a water expert. So I think we've exceeded my my capabilities.
Okay, got it. Over here.
Hi.
So, question for you. So, Donald Trump is a real estate developer from New York, never held office before, and here he comes and he wins the presidency. Pretty remarkable. How do you think he did? How effective was he as a president of the United States, having zero experience in government for overall? How effective was he in that role?
You know, any lack of effectiveness he had, Elliot, was due to his own narcissism as opposed to his intelligence or his capability. I witnessed multiple meetings where, for whatever reason, he was focused. He didn't really understand the subject matter, but he really understood which questions to ask. And once those questions were answered, he would press further and say, well, what if this happens versus that? And how do you know? And why is that important to me? Why don't I need to know this instead of that? He did every single thing that a good CEO would do, because in those particular meetings, he wasn't looking inward. He was focused on the issue. But there were other issues where, again, I witnessed where the issue was fairly clear, but it was always about him. You know, how does this make me look? How do I gain something in terms of self-aggrandizement or popularity? In which case, he was the worst of presidents. So I guess the simple answer is he clearly had the capability and has the capability, but there is something that trips in his mind that turns on what I would call this super narcissism, which really gets in his way. And it's unfortunate because he is a very, very bright guy.
Yeah, right here. We have time for just a couple more questions.
Yes, hi, I have a question about the Foreign Service Workers Union. How effective was the administration in getting its appointees for ambassadorships? Because I heard from some of my contacts in Washington that there were a lot of ambassadorships that they wanted to appoint, but that Nancy Pelosi and others were just basically kowtowing to the unions and blocking everybody.
Well, the confirmation of ambassadorships, you know, resides solely in the Senate. Starts with a Foreign Relations Committee, which was controlled by Democrats, and then, of course, the Senate itself. In my case, I was very fortunate. It's a very interesting anecdote. One of the things you have to do when you apply to be an ambassador is you have to disclose all of your political contributions going back for, I believe it was 20 years. And those are the contributions that are online that you can look up in the Federal Elections Commission. But not only do you have to disclose your contributions, you have to disclose the contributions of your spouse, your children, and your siblings. So it turns out my only sister, who I talked about earlier, who's 20 years older than I, is a rabid Democrat. So when I pulled this printout, I looked at all of the money, essentially, that I had given primarily to Republicans, and all of the money she had given 100% to Democrats. And I said, this is great. So I submitted it, and of course, all of the staff on the committee goes, this guy is right down the middle. He gives to the Republicans, the sister gives to the Democrats. We like him. So as a result, I was introduced to the Foreign Relations Committee. The two senators who gave their introductory speeches on my behalf were Senator Tillis, a conservative from North Carolina, who is a friend, and Senator Wyden, a liberal from Oregon. So I breezed through the Foreign Relations Committee, and I got unanimous confirmation in the Senate because I had this bipartisan thing. A lot of the friends that you probably had were partisan Republicans, which I am as well, but maybe they didn't have the benefit of having enough help from the other side, which is always a problem.
Yeah, right here, and then we'll go over there.
Hello. For someone who wants to work for the Foreign Service, besides knowing how and when to be brief, do you have any other quick recommendations?
Besides knowing when and how what?
To be brief and to not have a ton of white papers.
I still don't understand your question.
Besides being concise and getting to the point.
Oh, you mean what attributes to become a Foreign Service officer?
And to develop within myself.
I see. Well, the good thing about the career Foreign Service people is they become subject matter experts. And that's one of the reasons that I argue strenuously that more political appointees should be ambassadors rather than less, which is completely counterintuitive and contrarian to what the media says, which is, oh, these ambassadors are a bunch of rich fat cats. They buy these ambassadorships. They don't know what they're doing. They're cutting people out that have worked all their lives in this profession. And I couldn't disagree more, because people from my background and my colleagues, our job is to get in, advance the agenda of the United States, and get out. We're not there for a career. We're not there for the rest of our lives. And so the people that you're describing are the people that really help us make the decisions, because they will understand the particular country, the language, the law, the culture, because that's all they've done their entire career is study that. So they're incredible resources to the ambassador. And so I think the deputy should always be the subject matter expert, and the ambassador should be the political appointee. That's my view.
Mine too. Here, and then last question here.
You said that you led initially with envy, at least in part, and getting financial independence. And now you can buy all the Tic Tacs you want. Did anything switch for you in terms of what you learned? I adore that you lead and get out of the way in this capacity. So what changed in you from what you started with? Like how has what you've seen changed you as a leader, as a person, as a family man? What does that look like?
That's a really good question. It's a hard one to answer, because I'd have to lay down on a couch like I'm talking to a shrink. You know, you get to be a little bit more humble when your balloon has been popped a lot. And in my life, my balloon's been popped quite a bit. I remember my wife, when I told her I'm now officially an ambassador, I had taken the oath. And I said, now I get to be addressed as Mr. Ambassador. She looked at me and said, Mr. Ambassador, would you please take out the fucking garbage?
Yeah, understood. I think there was right here in the front.
It's now my ex-wife, by the way. No.
This is our last question.
Ambassador, earlier this year, Bill Barr spoke to us in a very similar setting. Listening to you closely tonight, I see many similarities about bright people wanting to help their country and go at it. Bill Barr, yourself, so many others. What was it about Donald Trump that drove so many of you to leave? And is there anyone who would be able to tell him to step back if the Republican Party needed to unite to confront 2024?
Well, your second question first, I hope there is. Because frankly, again, my own view, I supported him, as I said, up until January 6th. I'm not angry with him. I have no enmity toward him. I wish he had been successful. But I don't believe he can govern even if he's elected in 24. I believe he will be so saddled with investigations, potential calls for further impeachment, his family. What I want to see, and I think what most Republicans want to see, is they liked his policies. His policies barely had a chance to take hold. And if you really look at the country at the end of 2019, October, November of 19, the country, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, was pretty much headed in the right direction under any metric you want to look at. Everything was starting to work. Was it perfect? No, absolutely not. But it was a lot better than it is today. So we want those policies. We don't want the baggage that goes with those policies. That's the way I look at it. I think there are 6 or 7 or 8 candidates out there. I haven't made my own decision, whether it's Governor DeSantis, Governor Youngkin, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Haley, Vice President Pence, and others, all of whom could hit the ground running as President of the United States, day one. They would all largely follow the Trump policies because 3 of them worked for Trump, and they were deploying those policies. So I think as a nation, we're better off asking President Trump to become the elder statesman and having one of those candidates carry the banner forward.
Well, with that, Mr. Ambassador, Gordon, I've cherished this hour. I just so much appreciate your honesty, your straightforwardness and intelligence and all those things that made you a terrific ambassador. And on behalf of everyone here, thank you, Gordon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as our VIP guest